can be best understood in regard to 9 major shifts. And I'll start from the first one. The first shift, again, that today, in most audiences that I speak and in most professionals in the field would probably say, yes, you are right, we need to look beyond survival. And when I define survival, I'm not talking only about children's death, not only about of the physical survival of children, but basically we are talking about of physical survival and basic needs. And two of probably the best example would be first the infant mortality rates. That on one side, we really, if we didn't reach already, we are reaching the limit of our ability to lower infant mortality rates in some societies. If in Japan it's now 3.1 or 3.2 per 1,000 live births, I'm not sure we could, even statistically we cannot go much more down, and there's always will be some misfortunes or some problems, health problems that infants will die. The other part of the irrelevance of infant mortality rate is in regard to their policy impact. If we are using indicators in order to influence policy or to influence the creation of policies or better policies to solve the problem, then infant mortality rate is an indicator that has already been used. We know how to solve the problem for infant mortality rates. Most of the places where children are still dying in larger numbers, it's the question of how to bring the vaccine and the needle to the child. So the policy implications are clear. We need to devote more or to get better at doing it, but we know the solution. The question that is much more interesting, and we don't know yet, not how to measure, and definitely not how to create services or policies for, is how do we make sure that a child lives or grow up to the optimist of his physical potential. That he would come to the optimist height he could have come to, or would live the best physical life. A similar example I would take, which is less about survival and more about basic need, from the education field and the school enrollment rates. School enrollment rates are the basic indicator of child well-being in the education domain in most countries around the world. Yet in most of the Western countries, in many of the developing countries, at least at primary school, the issue is not anymore of access to education or the enrollment itself, because the school enrollment rates are way beyond 90 or 95% in most of the countries, but the issue is the quality of education that kids are getting. And we know much less how to measure the quality of education that children are getting. So this move from the survival and the basic need to the beyond survival it's a move that is already happening. People have accepted it, at least theoretically and methodologically, or conceptually would be probably the right word, but we still are facing major problems, and we don't have enough experience in defining those beyond survival indicators and how to measure them. This is becoming more problematic when we look on the second shift that I'm talking, and that's the shift from the negative to positive, which was also much harder to explain or much harder to gain support, I must admit. But the major argument here is a logical argument, and it's the fact that even if a child doesn't suffer from any risk factor and doesn't suffer from any problems or any failures, still it doesn't indicate proper growth, success, or well-being. It indicates that he's not at risk, or is not a distress or anything else. And the move from risk factors or negative behaviors to protective factors and positive indicators is a much more problematic move than the one I talked before, because positive indicators, as I'm always saying, to get to them you need to cross a minefield of values. It's much easier for us to agree what's negative in children's life, first of all because there's much more research on it, and for a longer period, than to agree what's positive in children's life. And I'm always giving the example of obedience. In our first meeting in Jerusalem in 1996, one of our colleagues from the Chinese University of Hong Kong wrote a paper called "Obey Their Parents, Love Their Country." And he talked about obedience as an indicator of children's well-being. And the same level of obedience in some cultures or some societies would be considered a positive indicator, And in other culture or other society will be considered a negative indicator of children's life. So when we are moving to this positive indicator, we are basically trying to describe what we want our children to be. And what we want our children to be is value-based and value-oriented. And another great example for this problematic nature of positive indicators is indicators of civic involvement. I'm a true supporter, a big supporter of theories or concepts who are saying that kids are involved in society. Kids who support democratic values, kids who accept minorities, their well-being is better than kids who doesn't accept the rights of minorities, who are not involved in society, and so on. But that's a value-driven ideology. And there are many cultures and many societies in the world who doesn't believe in those values. So when we speak about positive indicators, we are much more about values. The third shift, and here some of my colleagues or my friends don't like it so much when I say it, is what I call incorporating children's rights, but looking beyond children's rights. And when we started working in the mid-90s on our multinational project, some of our colleagues said, you don't need to think too much about a theoretical concept for children's well-being. Don't waste your time on conceptualizing children's well-being. Let's use the Convention on the Right of the Child as our theory or as our framework. But there is a problem with using children's rights for monitoring children's well-being. Because when you are monitoring rights, you are monitoring entitlements. You are monitoring if the kid gets what he should get. And when you are monitoring well-being, you are looking beyond that. You are trying to monitor a status that in many aspects is beyond the basic rights or the legal rights or the children's rights or whatever. So there is a difference between monitoring if the rights are implemented and monitoring the actual situation of children, but yet there is a shift toward more inclusiveness of children's rights perceptions and monitoring the rights of children as well. And in many aspects the convention was also a practical tool, because the convention also demands each of the states, the member states, to report to the UN committee every 5 years on the implementation of the rights in that specific country. Many of those reports include data on children's life and collecting data on children's life, and in that aspect it supported the movement. The next shift is probably the most problematic, and the one that still I would argue most of the people don't agree with. And that's a shift that in our multinational project that preceded the international society was a transatlantic debate, I must admit. On the one side were the Europeans, on the other side were especially the Americans. And that's a debate between well-being and well-becoming. And it sprung from the new sociology of childhood that argues that childhood is not only a preparation for adulthood, but also a life phase in itself. Now, most of the indicators till today that are used to measure children's well-being, if I'll be cynical for a moment, are measuring children's well-being by anticipating how much they will earn as adults. But it has nothing to do with what's the quality of life of children. And I'll give you one example of a contradiction, a simple contradiction. Economy theories, economy studies teach us that in order to have better opportunities for children, it's better for them to grow up in small families. The smaller the family, one sibling or two siblings, the bigger the chances of children for economic prosperity, better achievements in school, and economic prosperity as adults. On the other side, anthropology studies teach us that kids themselves prefer living in bigger families with more siblings. Now, if we are using either one to develop a policy, and if we are using the economy perspective to develop policy, we'll develop a policy like the government in Israel is trying to do in recent years, that would encourage families to be smaller. Wouldn't encourage births of the third and the fourth and the fifth child in the family. Now, if we go from the well-being perspective, then we will develop policies that will encourage families to have at least 3 kids in the family. Now that's kind of a neutral dilemma, but it's a dilemma. And it's true to many other things. And it has problems also with the children's rights